This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Today on CityCast Boise. Forget fiscal constraint and local control. Idaho's new wave of conservative lawmakers are pushing conspiracies and government overreach. So we're exploring a blistering critique of the state's far-right political machine. Because if banning vaccines, bullying librarians, and punishing dissent is the new conservative playbook, what exactly are they conserving? It's Tuesday, June 3rd. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. Joining me today is Greg Graff. He's a Republican and the creator of the Political Potatoes Substack. Thanks so much for joining me today, Greg.
Thanks, Lindsay.
You authored the viral article, The Death of Conservatism. But I would argue that Idaho is still a deeply conservative state. So what do you think conservatism actually means to most voters today?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there is what a lot of people believe conservatism to be, and then what is being described as conservatism now by those who demand that we call them conservatives. And therein lies the problem. What does it even mean anymore? And that was the point of this article, is when you see a group of legislators and groups that are behind them that help install these legislators to push these agendas say, oh, we have the most conservative group of legislators in Idaho in history. Great. Okay. What does that mean when they're passing bills that go against the conservative principles that many of us Republicans have known our whole lives?
And one of the early ideas in your piece is that people are abandoning conservatism for Christian nationalism. So before we get too deep into this also, how do you define Christian nationalism and how do you see it intertwining itself into Idaho politics?
Yes, there's been a growing and concerning trend shifting towards Christian nationalism. And how I would define it, how a lot of people are defining it, is when you look at Christianity as a whole, nothing wrong with it. I mean, most Idahoans are Christians. Most Americans are Christians. A lot of people say, well, we're a country founded on by Christians, and to some extent that is very true. However, our founding fathers wanted and put in place separation of church and state, and also not just freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. The idea that anyone has the right, the God-given, constitutionally protected right to worship as they please. And that some group should not say, oh no, our ideology, our theology is better than anyone else's, and therefore it should be the theology that defines and is used to write laws, to be legislated. And therein lies the problem. So when you have pastors utilizing, it's not just the cross in Christianity, it's the flag and the cross. And that somehow Christianity is this American concept, but Christian nationalists don't see it that way. They just see it as an American thing. And it's becoming a big problem because it's utilizing exclusionary tactics, othering people. The idea of utilizing theocratic ideas and ideology to enforce a particular ideology over another is deeply concerning.
So for Republicans who are people of faith, where do you draw the line between political activism and this theocratic overreach that's exclusionary?
If you have your own personal beliefs, totally get it, right? But the second you utilize those beliefs to enforce those ideas onto another person, you've crossed that line, right? You're now infringing on somebody else's personal liberty. And don't call yourself a conservative if you're going to be infringing other people's liberty. I mean, that's the whole point of freedom, right? These are legislators who sign their emails in liberty. Well, when you say you're doing things in the name of liberty and then actively working against other people's personal freedoms and liberties, that's wildly hypocritical.
So I'm curious, since I have you here, because I agree with what you're saying, where you're saying, you can have your own personal beliefs, but that should not be forced on someone by the government. So as a Republican, where do you fall, let's say, with the Idaho abortion ban?
Great question. Where do I fall personally? My personal beliefs on the issue don't matter. I'm not an elected official, right? I'm just someone with a blog. I don't matter. I'm nobody. But my personal beliefs on it is, you know what? It's none of my business, right? However, there are a lot of people passionate about this issue in Idaho, specifically Republicans, especially people who call themselves conservatives. You have a spectrum of belief systems. But for those who have strong opinions on this and feelings on it, okay, I would say 70-something% of the population agrees that, there should be some form of limiting abortions. And this goes across the political spectrum, both Democrats and independents and Republicans. But as you shift further right, more people will say, well, no, it should be criminalized, it should be banned, it should be law, all the way up to what you would call abortion abolitionists, which take a more extreme opinion of all abortion should be considered murder. When you ask, for instance, take legislators in East Idaho who are mostly LDS-based, they don't believe in that. They don't agree with abortion. They are pro-life advocates. However, you're not seeing their church say, oh, no exceptions, right? They kind of cringe at that idea, because telling someone that you have to carry a 13-year-old girl who is raped by their uncle, that they have to carry that child, because of incest, that's rough, right? But there are those who just feel like, their ideas, their ideological supremacy in this case, is better than anyone else's, and therefore they should be deciding and telling everyone else what to do.
And should be enforced by law.
Right.
Hey Boise, it's Lindsay. Let's keep it real. If you've got something great to offer, like a business or an event, you should be advertising with us. People in Boise trust us to tell them what's good, and that could be you. Our listeners care about what's happening, and they love a good local recommendation. So if you want to make sure the best audience in town knows about you, then advertise on CityCast Boise. Learn more by emailing us at ads@citycast.fm. That's ads@citycast.fm.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel or that white chocolate mocha. Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
So if conservatism is now a label being claimed by these political groups and political actors that are advancing legislation that you have talked about doesn't align with what you call traditional conservative values. So then who gets to define what conservatism is?
I don't know. I don't know who gets to define it. I guess at this moment, we're seeing this new conservative moment of people who are just really loud. And it becomes, who's the loudest? And so for those of us who are standing up and saying, no, this isn't right. If you're going to sit there and lie, use abusive tactics, gaslight, things like this, we should call you out on that. And then, of course, people like myself get a lot of pushback for doing that.
And you did call out in your piece several bills from Republican legislators who call themselves conservatives during this last legislative session that you said contradict these traditional conservative values like small government or personal liberty. What bills do you think were the most egregious, and why?
Well, let's take House Bill 93, right, which is the $50 million school choice bill. A lot of money was brought in from out of state from groups that sought to profit off taxpayer dollars, okay? This was a corporate welfare bill, plain and simple. Those who called themselves conservatives, they feel that if they can shift tax dollars towards private schools where effectively it's money being put into schools run by local Christian churches or whatnot, therefore, like, well, we now have a education system that aligns with our worldview. So never mind the fact that we're expanding government, never mind and ignore the fact that, we're blowing up the budget and taking away these ideas of local control and all these other conservative principles. And at the end of the day, they're funding the campaigns that help get the people aligned with the Freedom Foundation elected. So who cares, right? It's hypocritical. And, when you see people throwing their values out the window in exchange for money, that's somebody who's not truly principled.
And I before we move on, you mentioned the Idaho Freedom Foundation, and in the death of conservatism, you discuss the role of organizations like the Idaho Freedom Foundation and Stop Idaho Rhinos in this political rhetoric, in these kind of movements. What do you think everyday Idahoans who, are casually aware of politics, but, they're just trying to live their lives, what should they understand about how these groups operate?
Well, at the end of the day, we have a representative government. We elect people to represent us. Unfortunately, the way this works is we have legislators who are being elected who do not represent us. They represent a group that got them elected. There's a group called Citizens Alliance of Idaho, which is closely aligned with the Freedom Foundation and the Freedom Caucus. They make you sign a pledge. Oh, here's our 10-point pledge, and it's all these whatever. The pledge doesn't matter. That's a smokescreen. The money comes from an out-of-state group called Citizens Alliance of America, run by a guy named Cliff Maloney. The money goes to Citizens Alliance of America, funneled into Citizens Alliance of Idaho, where it's then all spent on a company called Mobilize the Message, which is owned by a private company owned by Cliff Maloney. It's all circular, okay? So they have picked their slate of candidates before the election. The bills that they run are specifically designed to prop up or be a litmus test to ensure that their people have the content that they can hand out at the door, said, oh, your opponent didn't vote for this bill that we made up over this narrative or issue that we just made up that wasn't even a problem before until we told you it was. And then they use that to attack the opponent so that you'll vote for their person. Okay, it's incredibly dishonest. Once that person's in office, they're literally handed a notebook or a binder that says, here's how you vote. Here's how you vote. Here's your script of what you say in committee hearings and what you say on the floor. They're texted what to do. Okay.
Who is giving them this book and texting them these things?
Well, as we've read in multiple articles, and it's been widely reported that people closely aligned with Freedom Foundation have done this for years. I've heard from legislators directly telling me they've seen this happen. They've witnessed this. That this group of legislators who are elected by this group are told what to do. And why do you think they have those freedom scores? It says, oh, you have a 99% freedom score. Well, that tells me there's a 1% chance they think for themselves.
Well, and that they do use that to campaign. And that's something that we've talked about is how influential or non-influential is that freedom score for voters? Do you think that these tactics are quite successful in Idaho to get these people elected, or are people pushing back? Is there no momentum against this? Like overall, what is your take on how effective this is in Idaho?
So over the past few years, it was effective. It's become less effective as people have understood that the freedom score is a joke, right? And now we're seeing what's really interesting is on the far right side, you have the new Idaho Freedom Caucus, members of that calling out the freedom score because like, hey, wait a second. You guys only scored your gang of 8, which are the 8 legislators most closely associated with Freedom Foundation, higher than anyone else, and that you manipulated and changed the scores after the session, which they did. They have an agenda. They're adjusting things along the way to fit their narrative, okay? So it's dishonest. And if a score is dishonest, then it has really no basis in reality and shouldn't be used. So the only power it has is the power we give it by saying it's legitimate. Well, it's not. And as more people are saying it and more people are reading about how it's a joke, then it becomes less effective. And then when they go out there and parade, oh, I have this score, I'm endorsed by this group, you realize, well, that group isn't legitimate. So who do you really represent? Because it's not the voters.
Mic check. 1, 2. Are we recording? Hi, I'm Michelle Bernstein, an award-winning chef, restaurateur, and mom. I have a lot on my plate, including my psoriatic arthritis symptoms. That's why I was prescribed Cosentyx. It helps me move better.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for people 2 years of age and older with active psoriatic arthritis. Don't use if you're allergic to Cosentyx. Before starting, get checked for tuberculosis. An increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like tuberculosis or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if inflammatory bowel disease symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
Ask your rheumatologist about Cosentyx.
16 years from today, Greg Gerstner will finally land the perfect cannonball. Epic splash. Unsuspecting friends. A work of art only possible because Greg is already meeting all these same people at AARP volunteer and community events that keep him active and involved and help make sure his happiness lives as long as he does. That's why the younger you are, the more you need AARP. Learn more at aarp.org/local.
And you also mentioned how a lot of these far-right political figures in Idaho who are calling themselves conservatives brand scientific research and, even things like the pride flag as existential threats to our state, existential threats to our society. Why do you think that these issues are so effective at mobilizing support for these politicians and these candidates or mobilizing public outcry?
Well, it goes back to, historically speaking, any group that wants to seek power over someone else needs an enemy, right? They need to point to a threat. They need to create that threat and amplify it and create this hype around it, right? It's solution in search of a problem. You want to create outrage. You want to create anger. And that drives people to action, okay? People in the middle typically are busy. They have busy lives. They're busy with soccer games and their kids' school and everything else. They have jobs and careers. They don't have time for this level of activism. So the far right understands, and also to some extent the far left as well, that you only need a fraction, about 3%, to win an election. So all you have to do is hyper-focus on getting this narrow group angry and upset about something. Inherently, we want to lean into something that fits our worldview or our bias. Knowing this, they strategically create content that amplifies things that lean into these biases and then take it a little bit further. That turns into collecting emails. That turns into getting people to donate and click on your website and then eventually target them for votes.
And I absolutely agree with you that I see this movement with these far-right politicians. I see this rhetoric that they're pushing. They're always touting their Freedom Foundation scores, their Liberty scores, whatever. But I just don't feel like it is isolated to the far right, because when we see these bills like the pride flag bills and other bills that you had talked about that infringe on personal freedom or, were really culture war attacks, not really governing, a wide swath of Republicans voted for those and voiced support for them. And so is this really isolated to the far right, or is this an issue potentially throughout the Republican Party?
It's not hard for someone to identify things that make someone feel uncomfortable. We looked at the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage. Republicans kind of got on board with it, like, we're just going to leave that alone. It's not a big issue. So that no longer became a huge sticking point that they could keep attacking because it just didn't poll well. So they had to find something that made people feel uncomfortable. So the far right and the strategists, whoever's coming up with these ideas, because it's not necessarily leadership in Idaho, right? They're pulling these from a national level. And they see that, well, you know what? People are really uncomfortable with the trans community. And I get it, right? So when you see something that people find uncomfortable, you lean into it, right? That's the strategy. And then you take it a little further. That's what they're doing. And so then they equate that one issue with the entire LGBT movement. And then you go after the pride flag, because the pride flag symbolizes that one thing that they've been yelling about for the last year or two. That's how that works.
Absolutely. But I think my question was, it is the far right who is bringing that up and pushing these narratives, bringing these bills. I mean, it was Heather Scott who asked the Supreme Court to potentially send Obergefell v. Hodges back to the states to overturn gay marriage. But other Republicans, it's not isolated to just the Freedom Caucus or, the New Freedom Caucus. Like large swaths of Republican legislators in Idaho are also voting for these bills. So is it really isolated to the group that is seeking like the Freedom Foundation score, or that is this far right group calling themselves conservatives, or is this ideology more widespread throughout the Republican Party?
You make a great point, and you're right. There are plenty of people who I wouldn't consider far right that voted in support of these bills. The primary reason for that is that this movement from the far right is their tactics are meant to be coercive. And so by outright lying and pushing these scare tactics, they're pushing people who wouldn't agree with these bills and forcing them into that corner like, hey, if you don't vote for this, you're going to get attacked. You're going to get primaried, and we're going to make up things about you that aren't true. So I'm not excusing their behavior or their votes. Some of them believe in it. Some of them don't. It's a spectrum of where they land. However, those tactics are very effective in getting others to go along with it.
Do you see any state or national Republican or more traditional conservative figures pushing back on this trend, or is this really becoming normalized on every level within the Republican Party?
There's been some cracks. There have been some people who have pushed back here and there. You'll occasionally see one of our congressional delegation do something, not very often, not as often as we'd like, but it is a national trend. It is a trend based on fear. If you speak up, you step out, the attacks are vicious. And the people who have elevated this movement are active practitioners of utilizing very abusive tactics.
I don't want you to get personal if you don't feel comfortable, but that response does sound like it's coming from a place of experience on your end, that you might have been the recipient of some of the attacks for pushing back or for calling out what's happening. Do you feel alienated by this movement within your own party, or do you feel like you have Republicans who agree with you? Like, how does that feel to be a Republican pushing back against what the loudest Republicans in the state are saying?
So 2-3 years ago, I would say I was pretty isolated. Looking at it right now, seeing the nearly 500,000 people or more that view my Substack and that growth, that's shifting. I am learning there's a lot more support for what I'm saying than there was before when people didn't know or weren't hearing this message. But yes, absolutely. I've been personally attacked. My family's been attacked. We've been threatened. Death threats. I've been sued a few times. Won those lawsuits. I mean, they brought what we call strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAP actions, multiple ones brought against me. I prevailed. It's been really, really hard. But the point there was that the far right does not like it when people call attention to their abusive behavior. And so their knee-jerk reaction is to attempt to silence that person and then make an example of them. And so when your job is threatened, when you're faced with severe financial burdens of legal costs, things like that, that has a crippling effect. And it's scary. Most people will be like, no, I'm out, right? I'm not going to put up with this. And nor should they have to. So I just was one of those who can't stand bullies. And so I stood my ground.
You end your piece by urging voters to push back on this movement. So I have a two-part question. What would effective pushback actually look like in Idaho, considering what you've experienced when you've pushed back? And do you really think that the political culture in Idaho could shift again to something that's more inclusive or pragmatic?
Yes. So first off is getting people to understand that all it takes is reading a little more, learning a little bit more, educating yourself on what's really happening. There is a void of information, unfortunately. Yes, the local media is doing, I would say they're not doing as well as they used to in calling this out. There's a lot of fear there. There's a lot of issues with publications and newspapers struggling. There's a lot of media on the far right side where they're pumping out content on a daily basis. I may be one of the only ones putting out content on a regular basis, countering that. So it's about understanding and educating yourself and finding out, learning what's really happening here. The second part is, I would say, you know what, we saw the far right try to push library board candidates in certain areas, and they got completely owned, right? They lost badly because people were like, you know, we're tired of this. We're tired of being lied to. We're tired of people trying to push their theocratic views on us. We don't want your new version of conservative values. We want the Idaho principle of live and let live, right? We want to be left alone to make our own choices. We believe in personal liberty. We believe in freedom. That's what most Idahoans want. And yes, you have people who have come in from other states, specifically on the West Coast, bringing their new values in and trying to change Idaho to what they think it should be. And we're now finally seeing people wake up and like, no, that's not okay. We liked Idaho the way it was. We're going to have a litmus test probably next year's primary elections. And as people realize that, well, you know what? You don't get to participate if you're not voting in the Republican primary election. And I'm not saying Democrats should cross over. I don't agree with that. But if you understand and align with ideas and values of limited government, lower taxes, local governance, things like that, well, then maybe you should be voting in the Republican primary, because if you don't, then you don't get a say in who represents you.
Well, Greg, thank you so much. We covered a lot of ground, and we will have a link to your Substack article because I do think it is a must-read for Idahoans. And thank you for taking the time to come on the show and break it down.
Thanks, Lindsay, for having me.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure and tell your friends about the show. We'll be back tomorrow morning with a sneak peek at a new podcast all about wolves in Idaho. See you then.